Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. How's everyone doing? That was not compelling. Now, let me set the context a little bit before I make the real introduction. We have some of the most distinguished guests from around the world here to speak to you. And when I said good and got the good in reply, it made it sound like you guys were not that interested in what they had to say. And I know that's not true. So we're gonna do this one more time. How's everyone doing? There we go. So this is the Making America Great Again panel. Oh no. Sorry, I had the wrong notes. I'm terribly embarrassed. This is I think may well be the highlight panel of the day. It's a panel on how the world looks at America's trade policies, and I think looks at what they see happening in America's political climate right now. We often talk about trade from the context of what does it mean economically for Americans and American communities. But when you really look at trade, it's about how we build relationships around the world and how we prevent countries from going to war with us and going to war with each other. And we're at such an interesting time now as we look at a trade policy that the rest of the world is taking notice and building their own relationships and coming to their own conclusions about what it means to be America these days. So I'm excited that we've got a distinguished group. It's going to be moderated by our friend and MC extraordinaire, Steve Clemons. It will include the Honorable Gerard Araud, the France's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Araud has held a number of positions, including ambassador to Israel, the French negotiator on the Iran nuclear issue, and the permanent representative to the United Nations. So he's done a few things in his life. We've also got the Honorable Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri, Singapore's ambassador to the United States, who also served as the ambassador to Indonesia, the High Commissioner to Malaysia and Australia. We have Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, Canada's Deputy Ambassador to the US. She, among other things, is an expert in all things trade and was Canada's chief negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then we have James Crabtree, former Mumbai bureau chief for the Financial Times, current professor of public policy at the National University of Singapore, and the author of The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age. So a big round of applause for Steve and our distinguished guests.
Come on in. Okay, was Steve funny enough? Okay, great job. Ambassador, yep, great. Ambassador Mirpuri, yes, I'm going to sit next to you.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll all be very cozy here. If I were to introduce you, I would make Ambassador Mirpuri of Singapore say, what went on with North Korea? Ambassador Araud and I first met a long time ago. We were talking about a mutual colleague of his, and he said, the guy's just not ruthless enough. Somehow Canada didn't put Donald Trump in a good mood in the G7 meeting before North Korea. And James Crabtree, I just want to say a word about James. And Liaquat Ahmed, stand up for a minute. You know, when I put this, you know, all of you are surprising, and I love you all equally, except I love Liaquat a little bit more. This is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Lords of Finance, How the Bankers Broke the World at One Point. You should all go on Amazon one click and buy his book. But the next book you should buy right after this, James Crabtree, the Billionaire Raj, and I guess it's India in the Gilded Age of something sort of, but just come out, and he's on a book tour. And so I've made James an honorary ambassador, not of Singapore, but of India, because he was the Mumbai bureau chief for the Financial Times. So we have a really great group here to discuss this. And I guess I want to just do a survey real quickly, and then we'll go into greater depth. Ambassador Mirpuri, we're just going to go down there. On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate as the as your view of the Trump administration's economic policy?
Is 1 better than 10? Or
Yeah, 10 being fantastic,
Okay.
huge, awesome, and 1 not leaving much to be desired.
I'd give them a 10.
You give him a 10. Okay,
I
there
give
we
him
got
10,
that. That's on the
yes.
record. Okay,
Yes.
that's a tweetable moment. Interesting. Ambassador Rode.
Oh, by definition, I give a 10. I'm a diplomat. You know.
Kirsten,
I think you're going to get 3 for 3 on the 10 from the diplomats.
really? James, do you have any independence?
I'll give him a 0.
You give him a 0. All right. So we've had star search here, and so let me just start with Ambassador Rode. As you look at it, we have essentially, we were talking about earlier this morning, trade is back as a topic. We have nations rolling out mega billion-dollar sanctions on each other. We have steel tariffs, and we have exemptions of those. We apparently have work inside the administration to try to undermine what membership in the WTO means. And so as you look at that package of things, does it give you any concern at all?
Actually, in this city, it's very difficult to say it, but President Trump is raising a lot of legitimate questions. The president has really basically has felt that a lot of our voters, and when I say voters, it's not only in America, but also in Europe, are simply saying, that they feel they have been victim of the free trade. Really, they all, in France, in our Rust Belt, for instance, which has been devastated the same way that your Rust Belt has been, they have elected 6 members of parliament for the far right. And 20 years ago, they were voting communist.
Right.
So it's a real problem, free trade. So it's not, you can't have an easy answer. You can discuss, you can contest the way President Trump is handling the issue, but I think you can't contest the fact that he is raising a legitimate question.
Ambassador Mirpuri?
The same thing, and it's not just the voter, it's the business community. The business community in the United States feels that there are issues in free trade that have disadvantaged them. They've had to do different things, and therefore, when the president goes out there and says, I will open markets for you because the established systems have not worked, they say, yes, sure, we'll cheer you on. Help us open these markets, which we've been trying for 20 years to try to do.
Do you have a pugnacious nationalist anti-trade right rising in Singapore?
Singapore is a globalized trade country. Trade is 3 times our GDP. We live and die by trade.
Right.
So we have to do it. As a small country, we also like a system that uses rules.
Do you think the
WTO,
US? Do you think the US will come back to the TPP?
Not for the foreseeable future. So we have carried on. The TPP has carried on without the US, the TPP minus, or what we call the CPTPP. Canada is a member of that as well. Because we don't expect the US is ready to come back to this now.
Deputy Ambassador, I'm interested in how you and Canada, which hosted the G7 meeting, and you are a party to the TPP, but Canada's out there in my book as sort of a norm setter about international rules and trying to at least create a system where there's greater and greater openness. That's my impression. I do know that we all have protected sectors and whatnot, but as you look at what's happening in the health of the international trading system, and I should mention that next week the Atlantic is going to have a session with the Deputy Director General of the WTO, Alan Wolf, who many of you may remember was one of the great representatives of the steel industry and was Bob Lighthizer biggest commercial rival in town dealing with steel, but he's going to be talking about that. But when it comes to the rules-based order, are you worried about it eroding?
Well, I think that what's, maybe just to pick up on trying to look at the positive of this particular moment that we're in. I think
the negative is okay too.
The positive about the moment that we're in is that it is requiring all of us within our countries, and then in talking with our partners, to really be able to put our fingers on why it is that we value international rules-based governance, whether it's in trade or any other area of international cooperation, peace and security and such. And I actually think that's really important. I think there's certain things that perhaps, and I can say this as having been a trade negotiator for many, many years, that we, Canada and Canadian experts in that area, kind of take for granted. We're a huge country, geographically, small population, high standard of living. Our prosperity and our standard of living depends very much on being able to trade openly and freely and having partners with whom we have stable relationships.
Right. And
nobody really questioned that. But I think that this moment in time, when we're having to explain to everybody why it matters and why it's important that we're all on the same page in trying to reinforce these rules and institutions, I think is important.
So If you had been a trade negotiator for the United States over the last 10 years instead of Canada, what did we get wrong?
Well, I mean, it's not really possible to put myself in the position of a U.S. trade negotiator. What I would say, though, is that the U.S. has shown important leadership in all of the trade fora that we work in, whether it's the WTO, whether it's, under the TPP at the time,
Right.
in trying to establish rules that made sense for Americans, just like Singapore was trying to establish rules that made sense for Singapore and Canada for Canadians. And I think that there's a lot of commonality there that I think still exists. I think that the reality is you never get everything that you want in a trade agreement. Nobody ever does. But that's part of trying to move forward as a group, recognizing that it has to work for everybody and it won't be perfect for probably anybody.
James, you gave the administration a low grade on its economic course and policy. How do you think, given the fact that you are essentially, this session is designed to be an offshore commentary on what we're doing here, how do you think really the rest of the world is looking at the choices we're making?
Let me say one thing first, which is Steve invited me on here. He didn't tell me he was going to put me on stage with the French ambassador just at this critical moment in the World Cup, for those of you following.
We're ending right at 2 o'clock.
You'll notice Gérard has an air of great Gallic confidence, whereas I'm sitting here biting my nails waiting for 2 o'clock. Let me say, Steve, so I think looking from America, you think the situation is bad. I live in Singapore. It's much worse than you think. This TPP decision, it's worth, they're going to be very diplomatic about this. It was an unmitigated disaster from the perception of Asian powers. And the risk now isn't so much that you move from a world in which the US is no longer the lead, it's that you flip very quickly into a world in which China is the lead. You have another large multilateral agreement which is going through at the moment called RCEP. It looks like it's going to be quite difficult to get India involved in that, so it's going to be the Southeast Asian countries and a few others in China. America obviously isn't part of that. And you have a kind of an array of things that are going on, which means that not only are the Trump administration damaging the overall architecture, the situation in the WTO looks perilous, but China knows what it's doing. It's developing a trade architecture of its own, and it's developing a different type of globalization through its Belt and Road Initiative. And so, the world is shifting in Asia, and it's shifting very quickly.
So, is that okay in the sense that, I guess this is a humble brag that I don't intend, but at Davos, which I get an opportunity to go to every once in a while,
every year, I imagine.
Yeah, the year and a half ago, the big personality that stood out was Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping said, don't worry about the United States, don't worry about the rules-based global order, don't worry about climate change. I am here, I will save you, was essentially the message that China gave. This last year, the two personalities were Emmanuel Macron and Modi of India. And I think Macron really stood up and gave the heartfelt address that he recognized that he had a responsibility to the liberal order in the world and to these great public causes in the world that will require international cooperation, and that if the U.S., he didn't mention the U.S. this way, but if there was absence in leadership, you had the impression that France was going to lead on that. And I guess, are we getting to a point where the rest of the world is going to have a kind of a la carte relationship with the United States, still diplomatically say it's okay, or are they beginning to count us out, James?
So I think if you're, let's say, who are the swing states here? So the most important ones are probably Japan and India. You look at America at the moment, and American policy is so changeable that you have to hedge your bets. You can't rely on this American administration. Sometimes they sort of do the thing you think they're going to do. Sometimes it behaves completely insanely. And so people are looking around and seeing what their options are. And in a sense, that's because you have an American administration which from one moment to the next, you're never really sure what it's going to do. And instead of, if you're a country like India, that's what my book is about. I lived there for 5 years. India has a peculiar attitude to trade. But what India wants at this moment in its development, like China 10, 15 years ago, it wants stability. It wants to grow quietly, develop its economy. It doesn't want things kind of ruined and shaken up. And so, well, what do you do if you're India, if America, supposedly your friend in the world, is ruining things and shaking things up? So you have to go, look at other options.
Gerard, is France becoming the soul and conscious of the global trade order, global economic order?
Oh, you would want to, but You know, I had a good friend of mine who said, you know, you the French, you are like a child in a school. You are very good at basketball. You are the best dribblers. You are really, you know all the rules, but you are 5'4". And, you know, basically, you know, France is what is France. So really, so we are not going to save the world. You know, really, basically.
Is that going to be your line if you're playing the British in this
really,
upcoming?
it's. No, at first, I think on the US, to be fair also, very often people forget that the foreign policy of President Trump is not that different from the foreign policy of President Obama. I'm really sorry to shock people. But if you look at Syria, if you look at Ukraine, you see that actually the policies of the two presidents are not that different. And they are based also on a common idea of a fatigue of the US towards foreign involvement. And frankly, after the mandate or the mandates of President Trump, really things are not going to go back to business as usual. You know, we are entering into basically a new world. You know, China, but also the fact that there is the US, you know, basically has been the gendarme of the world for the last 50, 70 years. And they really, and the Americans say, well, enough is enough. You know, the debate of NATO is totally legitimate. You know, really, USSR was a global threat, was a threat to the Americans. While now, it's a good question for the Americans. Why? You know, do you think that the young guy in Wisconsin is ready to die for Europe? That's a good question. So the questions are on the table. We have to redefine the world, redefine the transatlantic relationship, and nothing would be worse than to consider, again, that we are passing a nightmare and after that we'll be back to business as usual. No, it's a new world which is there, and that's the way what President Obama was implying, but also that President Trump in a very different way, I should say.
Is Singapore ready for an a la carte relationship with the United States? Are Asian nations related to kind of an on-again, off-again attention, or does that just give the whole field to China?
I think, you know, let's not underestimate where the US is. The US is still the most consequential country in the Asia Pacific. In trade, in security, in defense, the US is still number one. The amount they spend on that, the way that global supply chains, if you're talking about trade, they all largely end up in the United States.
But isn't that like saying that GE is a really big company, but if you looked at its stock lately, I mean, you just look at power. Power is a function of future expectations. So when you look at future expectations, is America winning on that level? That America is a big, sprawling country with a lot of capacity, but is it marshaled well enough that it's perceived that its stock is high in the world, or is its stock bottom basement?
Well, it's good that we're not monitoring the stock market on day-to-day or have quarterly reports like GE has to do. It is a deep reservoir of goodwill that the region feels, and the region wants the US to stay present, and we will work our best to make sure the US stays present. We are dealing with the rise of China, and that's an important accommodation that has to take place between the United States and China, but the impact of that is in the Asia Pacific. This North Korea issue, only one country could step up and bring North Korea to the table, and that was the United States. It didn't matter who else Chairman Kim was meeting. Until the US President said, I will sit down with you, it has. I mean, you can speak about what the outcomes may be, but it's definitely brought the tensions down. You no longer have missiles flying over the region. You no longer have nuclear testing. But there was only one big prize for the North Koreans, was to sit down and speak to the United States. And that's helped the region. And it goes across topic by topic, that how can we make sure the US remains having a place in the region, and we will work for that even as we see the emergence of China that becomes quite a significant geographical player. But we don't think that it can be done by excluding the United States from the region.
Kirsten, thank you. I think that part of what is in President Trump's mind on NAFTA and Europe, and these recent comments on the European Union have been fascinating, unnerving to some, that he said, look, the reason we did NAFTA, the reason we had to do this was to compete with these Europeans that got together, got a common market, and so he began to look at that in a zero-sum sense, that's bad for America, right? A lot of us may disagree with that, but at least that's a frame he's helped reveal. And that NAFTA, which he has problems with nonetheless, was done as a competitive move with Europe. And I'm just interested in, if the president were here today, what would you add to the conversation?
So You know what I would add to the conversation? I would add to the fact that I've been in DC for 11 months. And one of the things that I've done here.
How's it going?
It's a beautiful city. But one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing is crossing the country and going, from California
Right.
to the farming communities, to Michigan, to Georgia. And with the effort of talking to local governments, local lawmakers, businesses, farmers, everybody, about, in particular, the Canada-US economic relationship and what is going on the ground, on the factory floor, not necessarily around the boardroom tables. And one of the things that I think is really important and gets lost in conversations sometimes here is that those people, they know the value of trade. They know the value of trading relationships, in particular, because this is the conversation I have, in trading relationships with Canada. They know we're their best customer. They know they sell 30% of what they manufacture, depending on the sector, who I'm talking to us. And I think that that is the conversation that's important to keep front of mind, because what we're here trying to do is say NAFTA is old. It's an old agreement. It's almost 25 years old. Canada recently concluded and brought into force a trade agreement with Europe, state-of-the-art agreement that has all sorts of protections for labor, for environment, that deals with e-commerce, that deals with border facilitation, that is much more modern. We have the CPTPP that is doing the same thing. And it's unacceptable that we don't have an agreement that underpins our biggest trading relationship, $2 billion in trade every single day between our two countries, $2 billion. And we have a 25-year-old agreement. So what I would say is let's listen to the folks who are talking about what it means to them, and what they want, from what I've heard universally, is they want more of the same. They want to be more competitive. They want to have more efficient supply chains. They want more jobs, obviously, and they want more sustainable jobs. And we all know, right? It's the companies that trade that are more resilient. They're the ones who are going to be there for the long run. So that's what I would say.
Gerard, Kirsten raises an interesting point, which is America is a big place. There are governors, there are states, there are people, there are localities. When you talk back to Paris about what's going on, do you frame it in terms of where the White House is going, or do you have a pretty good take on what is happening in terms of states? And do you how do you leaven that out a little?
Well, it depends on the level of the decisions. In terms of trade, there is only one person who decides. Really, I went going to the Hill. All the congressmen are telling me, "Oh, yeah, we don't like tariffs, but that's the president. Who decides." So
you tell them they're useless to you then?
Really, it's on this issue. I think they say to me they are useless. Really, it's on all these issues. I think instead of moaning about the policy, we should also try to think in terms of the future of free trade. Again, you can say, we really, the idea of fair trade, it's really a very legitimate idea. As you know, really, in terms, for instance, of intellectual property, really, we could have a long conversation with China. And when my president was in town, really, he told President Trump, he said, "You have good points, and we should discuss together these issues." So our problem is not, is not saying, what does it mean fair trade, but it's to work together. The countries which have the same value, the same system, really we should work together. Because again, free trade, for the last 40 years, we have said free trade, the agreements are globally good.
Right.
But globally means pluses and minuses. And we have seen the revolt, the rebellion of the minuses, who are telling we don't want to be anymore the victims of free trade.
I mean, I thought you made that point earlier, and it's a very good one, that there is a danger in this debate, particularly on the progressive side of the spectrum, that you end up blaming all of this on President Trump. And that's not really fair, because the pro-trade advocates have done an absolutely hopeless job of trying to reinvent the free trade argument in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Those who are affected by trade, sometimes this is the debate about the losers from globalization. That's not the framing that you should use, but you know what we mean. We've got almost nowhere in moving beyond the sort of tired old debate about trade-related adjustment assistance and that kind of thing. Very little to be said about that. The nature of trade itself is changing very radically, less importance on goods, more importance on services. You know, if you think you were frightened by blue-collar outsourcing over the last 20 years, wait until we get to the services white-collar outsourcing that's going to happen over the next 20 years. And you see this on the Democratic side of the debate. You have Senator Booker on the panel here. He or whoever else is going to run for the Democratic nominee, almost no one, I think probably no candidate is going to stand up and defend free trade, which is disastrous because we know that the theoretical benefits are there from this system. But much of the fault, as Gerard said, resides in the advocates of free trade being unable either to articulate a different type of free trade agenda which brings more people along with it, or being imaginative in the way that you mesh trade and sort of social and education policies and other ways in which you can make this more inclusive.
You know, one of the things that I remember from a few years ago here on this stage, when I interviewed Mike Froman, then the U.S. Trade Representative, about TPP, I said to him, I'm used to trade deals where you've got CEOs lined up doing full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal, the FT, the New York Times, and they were non-existent. The only full-page ads supporting TPP were coming from generals and admirals in the national security crowd. And it raised an interesting question of whether this was a strategic deal or whether it was an economic one that was that was clamoring for. And he argued that my perceptions were mistaken and wrong, but I went back to check that there were no major purchases and ad purchases by the corporate community for that deal. It was largely looked at as a national security question and framed around China. So that brings me to China and your very interesting point about it. If we were sitting and doing a talk back panel, now we're talking back to the US, although you guys are not talking back that much, but we were to do this in Shanghai, and you were to talk back about China and its approach to voting. Let me just start with you, Ambassador Mapuri. Where do you have more problems, with the US or China?
I think the US is a much more open market. And to your point about, Mike Froman getting the national security sort of argument there, trade agreements are also strategic agreements. There are economic agreements, there are strategic agreements, there are also agreements that need to help people. So we've bundled a lot of things into these agreements. You cannot take away the strategic elements of NAFTA, of TPP, of the relationship the US has with the EU. These are all important parts of it. In China, and as your businesses find out, if you ask them, where would they rather that be more effort put into opening up? They would look at China and say, you need to open up more. You need to allow more American businesses in.
Gerard, China, US?
Of course, China. Really, we have real problems of China in terms of intellectual property, market access, public procurement. So we have a long way to go.
So that agenda converges with some of the problems France is having.
Yes.
Canada?
Yeah, no, China is much more challenging from a trade perspective in terms of investment flows. We have an investment treaty with them, but there are still many barriers that come from lack of transparency generally. We have open, transparent economies with published regulations, and that in China, it's often a very, very opaque, very hard to understand what's happening. The rules can change without much notice. Our businesses have challenges there. They also have success, as all of our businesses do. They have success there that's important, and so it's a complicated situation, but absolutely challenging.
So is the impression that we have that our major trading partners today don't have exactly a kumbaya relationship? Is that a mistake? We do, in fact, have a much more cooperation than James and I are reporting in the media?
I think that our core trading partners, including the US and Europe and our Asian partners, have a fundamental agreement on the main rules of the game. I believe that we do. Open, transparent, predictable trade and investment environments, that you live up to the commitments that you make. I think that we are facing a time where questions are being raised as to whether the institutions are really fulfilling the role that they've been designed to fulfill. But no, I think we do have a commonality at the high level.
James?
I think, again, to be fair to the Trump administration, so there is this sense, I think, often in audiences like this, maybe less diplomatic than our triumvirate to my right, that the Trump administration is simply sort of delinquent in its trade policy. And that is true, I think, in some respects, but not on the China technology IP agenda. I think at that point, in a sense, some of Trump's advisors and those who are in the administration have just pushed this debate forward and into the public view more quickly. And the more you look at that, the more you realize that this isn't a made-up thing. This is a real challenge, which is that China does need to develop certain kinds of strategic industrial manufacturing industries, and the only way it's going to do that is by getting access not necessarily only to American, but to Japanese, European advanced industrial technology. And this is very problematic. This is not a sort of something that if there was suddenly a Democrat in the White House was going to go away again. And I thought Ashok's point is a good one to stress as well, which is, sitting in Asia, you have this very acute sense of the changing geopolitics of the region, particularly China, India a little bit, America, but most countries in the region, particularly the ones who are US partners by heritage, they want American leadership. They understand that over the next 10, 20, 50 years, there is going to be a transition. They know that this is going to be incredibly difficult to manage. We don't tend to make a good job of transitions in which you had one prime power and then you've got two and a half. But they want America in there helping to manage this in a sensible and deft way. And in a sense, that's what makes the current situation so tragic. It's not as if people in Asia are sitting there saying, the Americans are off, well, that's delightful, good riddance to them, hello to China. That's not what's happening at all. People want US leadership, and they're not getting it.
And India, does it want US leadership?
I think India does. India has got much closer to the US. India has a much more problematic strategic relationship with China. And in theory, so one of the other good, we're being quite nice to the Trump administration. So President Trump,
You weren't nice at all at the beginning.
Well, he stole it nicely from the Japanese, but the phrase, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which has become the kind of theoretical cornerstone of US policy in this part of the world, at the moment is a bit of an empty vessel, but it has quite a lot of promise. It's an interesting way of conceptualizing the region. People are, they think there's some mileage in this. But the problem is, as I said before, India wants stability. And there are various things the Trump administration are doing that are annoying the Indians at the moment. So they canceled the bilateral dialogue last week. Trump has it in for certain types of technology-related visas, which India wants a lot. The trade wars, if it keeps going the way it's going, the problem is that eventually other countries, this isn't going to stay a US-China thing. Everyone else begins to say, well, if they're doing tariffs, we should do tariffs as well. And your local businesses begin to lobby you. And the heritage of moments in which you have problematic trade policies in the 20s and 30s and in the 70s is this snowballs quite quickly. You can already see pressure building in India to sort of, we should get in on this act as well. So I'm worried about the US-India bilateral as well. It's a big strategic opportunity, but there is a risk that that will also be damaged in this process.
I want to go to all of you in a moment, but let me ask you just finally about part of the shtick of the administration when it rolled out tariffs and began wrapping the knuckles of some of our closest allies and trading partners on steel was a national security exemption, taking an app. And Chrystia Freeland was not very happy about this, said it was insulting. Let me just start with you, Gerard, and then we'll just go around. What do you think about that national security dimension? I'm sure President Macron had a few words with the president about it.
I think the best part is that on the cars, really the US apparently is going to impose tariffs on European cars. And it will be also on the basis of national security. So we are discovering that the BMW and the Mercedes are a major security threat for the United States. It doesn't make sense. It's really it's distorting the use of specific legislature for protectionism. It's a protectionist decision.
Kirsten.
Well, I think our government's been pretty clear. It's inconceivable to us that imports of steel and aluminum from Canada could in any way pose a national security threat to the United States. Do you have a
national security exemption for things in Canada? Do you have the ability to do the same if you wanted to?
Yeah, we can. Well, under WTO rules in particular. But.
And what's the deal with milk? I keep hearing about milk. Is it milk really that much? Is it? I just want to know: is Trump's data correct?
Okay, so what I can here is a fact. Canada is actually the second biggest export market for U.S. dairy producers. So the idea that we have a closed market that isn't allowing U.S. dairy producers to sell their products into Canada is obviously not true. And the dairy products that come into Canada, making up that second biggest market, come in almost all of them, I think there's like 2%, that aren't completely duty-free. And it's the NAFTA that allowed for that, right? Those were negotiated exports under the NAFTA. So, you know, there's some
So complex picture,
misunderstandings.
but the president's numbers might still be right, is what I'm hearing.
I'm sorry?
Complex picture and trade-offs that are in the picture, but the president's, I was pretty shocked to hear the president, you know, actually lay out a piece of data, and I didn't know if it was true or not, but you haven't said he was wrong.
Well, no, he's wrong. The exports of milk, dairy products from the United States into Canada come in duty-free, and they represent, as I say, your second biggest
National
export
security
market.
exemption.
Well, you know, Singapore is not impacted by this, but I think the important thing where there are grievances, and there are grievances between the US and China, and there are adjustments that China has to make to, you know, recognize that their position in the world has changed from the time they joined WTO in the 2000 until today. They've become a much more significant economy. Where there are grievances, like for smaller countries, what we want to do is use the rules. There are good institutional rules that are there in the WTO. If the WTO is not working, let's make it work. Let's not break it up and throw it away. And this goes across the board for everything that we do. For smaller countries in particular, no one's got the heft of the United States, or the Chinese may be able to stand up to them. But for the rest of us, use the rules. Let's build up the institutional systems that are there. Where there are weaknesses, let's strengthen those and make sure they actually work better for everyone. I think that's the key, because only then can other countries, countries like India, countries in Africa, get them following those rules as well. And when that transition takes place of the US becoming, you know, they had moved from 40% of global GDP to 25%, they'll go down a little bit more.
Right.
Once you have a rule-based system, I think it makes everyone a lot more reassured.
James?
I mean, you've got a great panel here because you, in a sense, between Canada, France, and Singapore, you have probably the three leading sensible trade advocates in the world. The risk, though, as you say, on the WTO, is we're sort of backing ourselves into a corner here, right? So you come out of these processes, and the choice set is going to be probably either the US goes to the WTO and loses, and then the president throws his toys out of the pram, or he just decides not to go to the WTO at all and blows the system up. So the scenario in which the sort of the decision-making process of the WTO survives this looks pretty dicey from where I'm sitting, and that obviously would be very, very damaging, because then you're in a whole new different world.
Let me open up to all of you. We've got tons. Pat Malloy here in the middle, and then we've got a microphone running to you here. This is Daniel, right? You're sticking with it, Daniel. You have a cookie.
This is,
Go ahead.
This is directed to the Deputy Ambassador Hillman. I was American Vice Consul in Montreal for 2 years, so I care very much for our Canadian friends. And I worked on the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which I was all in favor of. Section 232 of our trade law permits us to restrict imports of items in which we're wiping out our domestic industry important to our national security.
Right.
That's steel and aluminum. There's an Article 21 of the WTO that permits a country to do national security exemptions from the WTO rules. Ambassador Lighthizer has said, how can Canada and the EU and others counter those by putting tariffs on our goods because in retaliation for the Section 232 without first winning a case in the WTO that what we're doing is improper? I think he said it's hypocrisy for these other countries behaving that way. They should use the WTO process, which all of them say they really care a lot for.
So let me get a response.
Throw that out for you guys to think.
How
and give
about
me a
that?
response on that.
Rally around 232. This is what Paula Stern raised earlier on this. It's at a slightly different angle. But thoughts on that issue of challenging with the WTO. Kirsten?
I think that the answer to the question lies in the facts around this particular area of trade. So what we have is an agreement between our countries that's enshrined in U.S. domestic legislation. The defense industrial base of the United States includes Canada. And what that means is that essentially Canadian production of steel and iron and aluminum that go into the manufacturing, either in Canada or in the U.S., of equipment designed to protect, to supply our militaries and our defense operations and protect our North American territory, are deemed to be of one origin. And that's fundamental to the Canadian reaction to this particular, invoking that particular clause in this situation. The other thing I would point out is that we are actually the biggest customer for U.S. steel exports. We buy about 50% of everything that the United States exports in the steel sector.
The ambassador of France, how did the EU put tariffs on without first winning a case in the WTO?
For those watching online, how did the EU? So quick reaction, steel.
No, actually, we consider it's a violation of the WTO rules. So we are considering it's a violation of the WTO rules. So we have imposing retaliation tariffs, really according to the rules, the precise rules of the WTO. So as you may know, we have imposed tariffs for some reasons of the Bourbon Kentucky of Mr. Mitch McConnell, on Harley-Davidson bikes, that the retaliation, it's tit for tat policy. And if there are tariffs imposed on the cars, there will be billions also of.
We'll be back. We'll do the rest over drinks. Roger Libby of DHL.
Thank you very much, Steve. Part of the justification the president has used for some of the tariff measures has been the bilateral trade deficits, which seem to be tied to thinking that I make something and sell to you, or you make something and sell to me. Whereas the reality of global value chains is that we're making stuff together. And I think, as we have the Deputy Ambassador from Canada, how a Canadian import in the United States has, on average, about 25% US content. So my question is, for people involved in trade who are trying to find a positive message on the value of trade, how do we get past this sort of archaic view of bilateral trade deficits based on just single products moving instead of seeing the connectedness?
Ashok.
Well, it's not a metric that we judge in the basis of the economic health of the Singapore-US relationship. The US has been consistently having a surplus with us, surplus in trade in goods, surplus in trade in services. They've been doing this since we signed the Singapore-US FTA more than 10 years ago. But we don't think it's one metric. We're not asking the US to fix the fact that Singapore has got deficits with the US. We think other things are more important.
Gerard?
No, the fact is that with this administration, we have really the impression that the focus is only on goods, for instance. There is it's right, the European Union has a trade surplus in goods, but actually has a deficit in services. And but every time that we have tried to have a conversation on both, the answer has been on goods. That's the first point. And the second point is true also that this administration has a vision of trade as a zero-sum game. With each country, you should have a balance, a zero balance, which doesn't make really sense in our times of modern economy. So I think it makes the conversation with the administration a bit difficult, really, because we are trying to argue about the chain of supply, about services, but in a sense to no avail. The answer is always, what is your trade deficit in terms of goods?
Kirsten?
Yeah, I mean, really just to reiterate, we don't see balances of trade as being a proper metric for the value and health of a trading relationship either. We happen to have a pretty much balanced trade relationship with the United States, and given that we're 1/10 the size of the United States, I think that speaks volumes. But I could go back to what I was saying about going around and talking to individuals who are working in firms and who are working in industries that are trading. People do recognize, if you take the time to really talk about it, that it's not only about selling to another country, it's about having supply chains, having inputs that are reliable, that are cost effective. And it's going to get more and more important as we move higher and higher up the value chain. And I think it's a complicated conversation to have, but it's one that is
James,
essential.
Thank you. James, quick thought?
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned global value chains. I mean, that I think is one of the questions we don't look at enough, which is what effect is this going to be? You mentioned GE. GE has taken the decision to radically localize production, so it would make stuff in one part of the world. Now it's making it in 7 different parts of the world. Other people are going to pull production back towards their home markets. But this disruption between the US and China is not simply going to be, or the US and Canada, whoever it is not simply about those countries and the harm to those countries. It's going to be how all of the companies that exist in this ecosystem then decide to react to a new era of greater trade tensions. That's something that, it's hard to say, but it's not, neither of these options are great.
You know, I feel as somebody who's worked on trade policy for many years, and I worked on it 20 years ago, I feel like those people and players and issues of 20 years ago have somehow just come back and got coughed up today, and we're back in the middle of it. It's fascinating. And I'll just say, just in conclusion, you know, we know the Atlantic and you know, FT, we're storytellers. We tell stories. I'm always interested in who people's villains are in the stories. So in just like 10 seconds, James, who's the villain in the trade story if you were to write that?
I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? He lives just down the road.
Yeah. Kirsten?
You know, I don't know. I can't put.
Just be creative. It could be inertia. It could be.
Okay. I think that perhaps taking certain things for granted that we shouldn't have for too many years.
Good answer. Gerard?
Again, we have been repeating free trade is good, and that was a mistake. Free trade is good globally, but no human being is global.
That's a great line, too. Ashok, you get the last word?
Yeah, well, coming from a small country, Singapore is the good guy. We're not the villains in this. We do all the right things. We do the IP, rules of everything right, so we're fine.
There we have it. What a great discussion. Far better than I thought it was going to be. Ambassador Ashok Mapuri of Singapore, Ambassador Gerard Araud of France, Deputy Ambassador Kirsten Hillman of Canada, thank you so much, and James Crabtree, and buy his book, The Billionaire Raj. Thank you so much.